Carbohydrate hydrogel products in endurance sports, are they worth it? This is the question we are asking today to Stephen Mears and Lewis James, who's making his second appearance here on Fuel the Pedal. We all know the central role that carbohydrate ingestion endurance events plays in fueling high-intensity exercise, and we can say that this is pretty well established. But if things were so simple as eating or drinking unlimited amounts of carbohydrate-rich foods and drinks while riding or running, we wouldn't be having this conversation. A recent food technology innovation created new carbohydrate drinks and gels with added sodium alginate and pectin in solutions of multiple transportable carbohydrates with the intention of encapsulating those carbohydrate molecules in the stomach, forming a gel which allegedly enables a smooth transportation of the drink through the stomach to the intestine. But are the claims of improved gastric emptying, increased carbohydrate oxidation, and reduced gastrointestinal symptoms supported by science? Today, with Lewis James and Stephen Mears, we'll go through the research that has been performed with such products, some of which by their own research group at Loughborough University, and have their take about the potential use of carbohydrate hydrogel products as an alternative to traditional carbohydrate sports drinks. This is episode 37, Carbohydrate Hydrogel Products in Endurance Sport. Are they worth it? Welcome to Fuel the Pedal Podcast. Welcome back to Fuel the Pedal Podcast. Thank you for tuning in and for choosing Fuel the Pedal to keep you company in the next hour or so. I am still your host, Gabriel Martins, proud Portuguese nutritionist, still broadcasting from Madrid and trying to bring you insightful conversations with researchers and experts on their respective fields, and also trying very, very hard not to add up to the already existing noise and excess of unfiltered information around the internet regarding different topics in sports nutrition applied to cycling and endurance sports. And today I have even greater reasons to be proud of being a Portuguese, and if you're a cycling fan and have been watching this year's Giro d'Italia, I bet you know what I'm talking about, and I want to eternalize this moment here on Fuel the Pedal. João Almeida is the reason for mine and many other Portuguese fans' excitement, the young Portuguese cyclist for the Deceuninck Quick-Step who made his Grand Tour debut on this year's Giro d'Italia has been putting quite a show for the cycling fans and reminding the Portuguese that there are other sports with great Portuguese athletes besides football. João Almeida became the youngest rider in history with the most days in the Malha Rosa, 15 days in total, a jersey he was able to defend and proudly represent until stage 18. On stage 18, João didn't give up after losing contact with the punishing double-digit gradients of the Stelvio and continued to push on despite becoming aware that his pink dream was coming to an end with each kilometer. Almeida put himself deep in the pain cave and continued to soldier on, even clawing back time on the long descent to Laghi di Cancano, the last climb of the stage used for the first time in this race. Despite this, for me, João is already a champion and I want to immortalize his effort and guts here on Fuel the Pedal. Obrigado e parabéns, João. We are recording this after stage 20 of the Giro d'Italia, so since you are listening to this now, you already know the name of the winner of this year's atypical edition of the Giro d'Italia. Lucky you. Moving on to today's talk, I believe this topic is important since there are many cyclists and runners using this type of hydrogel-based carbohydrate drinks, but the science to study their effects has just started to come up in the past 2 years or so, and I thought it would be worth a shot to bring here some of the researchers who performed these works to have their take on the subject and simply not present the data which is sometimes, let's say, reductionist, but also provide a critical overview on the application of the knowledge if the research can be compared to real race-like scenarios where riders are cycling for many hours with a lot of different foods on their stomach and not in a lab setting. And this is really important, and I want you to remember this point and be on the lookout for this question throughout today's talk. So in this interview, I believe it's important to focus on three main aspects: substrate oxidation, gastrointestinal symptoms, and exercise performance, with a particular focus on the research performed with cyclists and the possible applications these products may have when compared to traditional sports drinks. So let's get down to business with Dr. Lewis James and Dr. Stephen Mears up next on Fuel the Pedal Podcast. And from Loughborough University, we have with us for the first time Stephen Mears. Welcome to the show, Steve. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Gabriel. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Really excited about today's talk. And for the second time on Fuel the Pedal, Lewis James, this time not to talk about milk, but yet again another drinking-related episode. It's great to have you here again, Lewis. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Gabriel. Great to be here again.
Gentlemen, it's fantastic to have you both here to tackle this topic, and when this whole unfortunate situation passes, I hope we can move on from milk and hydrogel drinks to drink and discuss malted barley-based drinks here in Madrid. Gentlemen, what do you say?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, nice in the sun.
We missed our chance when Lewis was here in Madrid last year, but hopefully we can make it count next time, hopefully with you, Steve, as well. But before getting into beer, let's go for hydrogel drinks, and I'm really looking forward to have you share with us your expertise in this topic. I think we could call it still an emerging topic. I never know what's the lifetime of a trend in sports nutrition, as they often come and go. But nevertheless, I believe this is an important topic to be debated and presented here, since there is a growing amount of research dedicated to studying hydrogel drinks, some of it by your own research group. But we do need some proper introductions first before getting down to business. Steve, would you do the honors and present yourself to the listeners and some of the work you've been doing?
Hi, so I'm Dr. Steve Mears. I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise nutrition at Loughborough University. Main sort of two areas that I tend to look at are nutritional interventions for endurance performance, mainly related to carbohydrate metabolism and hydration. And then more recently, looking at the health aspect of endurance exercise with a particular focus on how hydration status might affect function of the kidney.
Interesting, a mix of sports and clinical research background. And let's turn to Lewis James. For all who didn't have a chance to listen to episode 10 and may not be familiar with you, could you tell us a bit about your background and the research you're mostly involved with?
Yeah, no problem. So similar to Steve, I'm an academic here at Loughborough, teaching and research. And my main focus from a research perspective is all things hydration and fluid. We look at both kind of exercise performance and recovery, but also some health aspects of water intake and, optimizing water intake for health too. The composition of fluids is also of interest to me, because fluids and drinks are a means of delivering other nutrients that are relevant for sport and exercise nutrition. Broadly fluid and anything that fluids contain.
Brilliant. So for today's topic, we are going to talk about hydrogel-based drinks, or the addition of alginate and pectin to some new carbohydrate drink formulations. And why is this relevant? Well, as stated in the intro of this episode, it is known that exogenous carbohydrate ingestion during prolonged endurance exercise can enhance performance, at least in events of sufficient intensity and duration to be limited by carbohydrate availability. And this has been a recurrent topic here on Fuel the Pedal with guests such as Dr. James Morton and Dr. Sam Impey, where we've talked about periodizing carbohydrate intake throughout the season. And on the gastrointestinal symptoms side of things, Dr. Patrick Wilson and Dr. Jamie Pugh talking about gut training to better adapt our digestive system to minimize gut discomfort while aiming for the recommended amounts of 90 grams per hour in road cycling events. And the science has developed a lot in this past decade regarding this topic of ideal carbohydrate combination or composition with multiple transportable carbohydrate sources to maximize carbohydrate uptake by the gut. But the truth is, athletes have always struggled to fuel their bodies without feeling gastrointestinal complaints during such events. And perhaps this is what prompted the development of this hydrogel technology. And these supplements basically combine typical carbohydrate sources with pectin, a soluble fiber, and alginate, a polymer derived from seaweed, which undergoes gelation on contact with low pH of the stomach to allegedly encapsulate the carbohydrate. And I won't say much more, otherwise I will ruin the first question I have for you, Steve. So this is the main reason for having with us today Dr. Lewis James and Dr. Stephen Mears to discuss this issue and find out if these drinks live up to their claims and are a good alternative when compared to traditional sports drinks not containing this addition of alginate and pectin. So, Steve, for the listeners to have some initial context on this topic, could you go deeper into this hydrogel technology and just tell us about how different are they really when compared to regular sports drinks, and what would be the main claims advocated by the brands manufacturing these drinks and gels?
Yeah, of course. So It's a fairly new technology in drinks, perhaps in the last 4 to 5 years, where companies have started adding different dietary fibers to the drink composition. So in addition to typical drink compositions of maltodextrin and fructose to have a multiple transportable carbohydrates, they've added pectin and alginate. So alginate originally from seaweed and pectin from fruits. And they can add these into the drink alongside the maltodextrin and fructose. And these, when they enter the stomach, where there's a low pH environment, form a hydrogel, which supposedly can encapsulate the substrates, i.e. in this case, carbohydrate and sodium, and then sort of protect it from sensors within the duodenum that regulate gastric emptying. So the sensors can't detect the carbohydrate, so don't tend to regulate it as much, and therefore more carbohydrate encapsulated in this hydrogel can escape or empty from the stomach into the duodenum, into the intestines, where the pH increases again, the hydrogel dissolves, and in theory there's more carbohydrate now in the intestine, which can go through the transport system and enter the circulation. So really the aim is to increase gastric emptying of carbohydrate from the stomach.
And that is indeed one of the claims of these products, which claim that by encapsulating these carbohydrates and allowing for a smoother passage through the gut, concentrations up to 14% of these glucose-fructose mixes can be absorbed without or with minimal gastrointestinal symptoms. But my question for you, Louis, would be, does this really matter when it's pretty much established that the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation is around 90 grams per hour, and there's probably a limit of how much carbohydrate your gut can uptake?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated question, as they all end up being, Gabriel. But you're right. There is a limit once you get to the intestines. But the potential benefit here, and I think broadly the use of alginate and pectin to produce these hydrogels is it is quite an interesting change in the sports drinks market, which has largely remained unchanged since sports drinks were first conceived. 6% carbohydrate drinks that are used by athletes. So it's quite an exciting proposition to be investigating, and that's really why we started doing a little bit of work into it as a strategy. As you say, once the carbohydrate reaches the intestines, probably the rate at which it is absorbed across the intestinal epithelia and is then available in the blood and potentially for the working muscle is limited by the transporters present in the intestine. So the rate at which it moves out of the stomach is probably not important for how quickly, and there's evidence to support that gastric emptying isn't the rate limiting step in that process. Enough carbohydrate can make it through the intestines to saturate those transport proteins and provide adequate carbohydrate there and to be absorbed, as long as it's the right kind of type of carbohydrate. But the interesting proposition here, of course, is that if you can speed the rate at which things empty from the stomach, you can potentially improve at least upper GI comfort whilst exercising, and that on its own might be an interesting proposition. I think the percentage of carbohydrate for me is a bit of a moot point, really, because if you consider the type of volumes of fluid that an athlete, whether it's a cyclist or a runner, would voluntarily choose to consume during exercise, we're probably talking about consumption of drinks at a rate below which would be required to optimally provide carbohydrate. So if you were to consume a 6% carbohydrate drink and you were, say, a cyclist that was cycling for 4 or 5 hours, the recommendations that are put together, under scientific consensus, suggest about 90 grams per hour. Clearly, that means an ingestion rate, if you only consume fluid, of 1.5 litres per hour, consistently over that, 4 or 5 hour ride, which very few endurance athletes would do. So by default, you're needing to also consume gels or other foods alongside that 6% carbohydrate drink to provide that carbohydrate. And essentially, once those gels, foods and drink all mix in the stomach, they would be higher than 6% anyway. So the percentage isn't that important for me, actually. I don't think it's that much of an important factor, because if you're looking to provide 90 grams per hour, you need to provide 90 grams, and the volume of fluid that's consumed alongside it won't change that much. So broadly, I think it's the upper GI effects and kind of stomach comfort, really, where we might see beneficial effects.
There are some really great points there, Lewis. One of them being this willingness to change the market of sports drinks and hydration that has been pretty much unchanged in the past decade or so. And even though the rate limiting factor for carbohydrate uptake is in the gut and not in the stomach, the proposition of increased gastric emptying is still very interesting if it can reduce upper GI discomfort. Then I would highlight for the listeners the fact that perhaps the percentage of carbohydrate contained in the drink itself is perhaps not as important, and this is something that has crossed my mind before. After all, cyclists and runners mix a variety of drinks, gels and sports foods, and we're not really going to ingest those 90 grams per hour or any other amount through sports drinks only. That would be really unpractical, since we would have to ingest those 1.5 liters that you mentioned. And this is perhaps a limitation we still face on the research looking at GI comfort and other parameters when studying this drink, since we put subjects consuming only the drink itself in the lab setting, sometimes even fasted, and cyclists in the race context. First of all, they are not in a fasted state, and as you said, consume a lot of different foods, and I really want to come back to this point later on, so let's lock this one down in our minds for the moment. This topic has certainly captivated much attention in the last 2 years or so. Many research labs around the globe set out to see if these claims were true, mainly by focusing on substrate oxidation, mainly carbohydrate, GI symptoms and performance. And one of the research groups focusing on this was yours. And I think it's a good idea to have you talk about this research you performed with trained cyclists. So Steve, could you talk us through what you did, what parameters you looked at, and the main findings?
Of course. So we recently completed a study in the summer of 2019 and thought, we've got these new sports drinks on the market and nothing's been done in them. They've been around for a couple of years, and anecdotally, elite athletes are performing very well on them. But the question is does the scientific, do they match up when you test them scientifically in the lab? And so we thought we'd try and look at them in cyclists. We had a couple of good master's students, James Worley and George Mason, who were part of the group at that point. They had access to some good cyclists, and we thought, well, we can test this. And then it became a bit of a race against time, because it seemed like 4 or 5 other groups were doing the same thing. So we recruited 8 well-trained cyclists, VO2 max of about 62 mils per kilogram per minute. Most of them were racers. They were racing during that summer, and we got them to come in after a breakfast and then cycle for 2 hours at 55 watt max. So around about 60% VO2 max. And then, so steady pace. Most of them found it reasonably comfortable. And then following that, we gave them a performance test. So we typically in our lab use a linear factor time trial. So we set amount of work to be completed if they worked and it would take about 20 minutes if they pedaled at a fixed cadence. If they wanted to go faster, complete it quicker, then they just increase their cadence. And if they slowed their cadence down, they'd go a bit slower. So the aim was to match it up for about 20 minutes so that it would simulate close to a 10-mile time trial. And the things we looked at were in terms of oxidation, so carbohydrate oxidation, performance, and gastrointestinal comfort. And we fed, during the 2 hours preload, we fed either a hydrogel drink technology at about just under 70 grams per hour, or a matched carbohydrate drink just containing maltodextrin and fructose with some salt added in there as well. So the carbohydrate contents were the same in the same ratios. And then we looked at, as I say, total carbohydrate oxidation, performance, and GI comfort. And we didn't find any difference between carbohydrate oxidation. Performance was very similar. And apart from slightly increased stomach fullness in the hydrogel condition, perception of GI symptoms was very similar between the two conditions. So no real difference between what you would typically do as a homemade sports drink versus a commercially bought hydrogel drink.
So, by looking at your study, we have one initial indication that hydrogel drinks are not different when it comes to substrate oxidation, gastrointestinal symptoms, and exercise performance. But I do want to get into the total body of evidence regarding this. And this is perhaps where I will jump in and come back to the limitation on research that I was referring to, Lewis, and when talking about giving subjects a mix of foods along with the tested drinks and not just the drink itself. And I guess this comes down to the debate of doing more lab-based experiments or the so-called ecological or field-based research. And I'm sorry for insisting in this, Lewis, but I think this is important to highlight. Do you believe this can condition in some way the applicability of the research, in this case, the research involving hydrogel technology?
Yeah, I think generally in research, we take a very reductionist approach, and I think we need to consider better the practical utility of those experiments that we do in the lab. Now, I'm not a big believer in, trying to do lots of field-based research, because unfortunately the lack of control in field-based research or, research with very high-level athletes can mean that you can't necessarily derive, causality in that study. And to see whether that one factor that you're trying to manipulate is having a causative effect. But I think you're right. It does raise an interesting point. Most bike riders that I know, say in the UK at the moment, it's not that warm. If I was to go for a 3-hour ride with a few people that I would ride with, nobody would be taking more than one 750 milliliter bottle of fluid with them. You just don't need that much fluid. You'd be able to maintain euhydration, or at least less than 2% dehydration, certainly at this time of year, in most circumstances, in a 2 to 3 hour ride with that sort of volume of fluid. Now, clearly that can't possibly deliver, well, you'd have to have a very, very high carbohydrate content of that fluid to be able to deliver, what would be optimal. Now, some riders won't be aiming for 60 to 90 grams an hour in every single training ride, and there's a question as to whether they should or shouldn't, but that's not the question for this podcast. If you're trying to achieve that, then using a variety of sources is probably one of the most efficacious ways of doing it. But there are also practical considerations as well. So if we take it out of cycling and look at running, because, as an endurance sport, cycling and running are very different, it's very difficult for one to carry fluid with them whilst they're running. If you carry a bottle, it changes your the way you run in a manner that, isn't necessarily positive. And that provides some kind of barriers to actually consuming fluid during that run. Cycling, you can carry some, but you probably can't carry everything that you need. And of course, you can stop and refill, but do you refill something that's the same as what you started with, or do you buy what you can from a shop, or how do you do that? There are a load of practical considerations there that we need to take into account, and I certainly think with cycling in particular, you need to consider those multiple feeding strategies that a cyclist would generally use. It depends who they are, really. Some will consume gels, some will consume bars, or flapjacks or sweets or various drinks as well. So I think that the reason why our research looks like that is this reductionist approach of just looking at one element and almost trying to extrapolate out potential differences between trials to really see whether there's an effect there. If there is an effect there, what we really need to do is then hone that in and see whether on a practical perspective, with the largest practical difference in those different strategies, we still find an effect. And I guess the biggest example of that would be kind of our main area of research, which is dehydration and hydration. I think we've shown quite clearly that dehydration influences performance in a negative way. But in those studies, we are looking at two extremes. We're looking at somebody who's had virtually nothing for 2.5 hours versus somebody who's replaced all the fluids that they lost in that 2 to 2.5 hours. We haven't started to really hone in and look at those small differences. And if you're looking at a practical strategy is having 1.5 liters better than having 0.75 liters, or 1 liter better than half a liter, and those are the real practical considerations that the research needs to start to look at from a practical perspective.
Great points there, Lewis. Field-based experiments do tend to have more variables to consider, and we may lose track of the condition we want to control, and perhaps therefore we may need both types of research to have a complementary view. Anyway, this was just a point that I wanted to have your opinion on, and the question I was originally aiming to direct to you is regarding the effects of hydrogel drinks in substrate oxidation. In this particular case, if we see an increased exogenous carbohydrate oxidation using these drinks in comparison to carbohydrate-matched sports drinks. So what does the total amount of evidence show us regarding this, Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, the various different studies that are out there from various different labs around the world at the moment point mainly in the same direction, and that seems to be there's not much difference between a hydrogel type sports drink and a kind of non-hydrogel type sports drink for all of those measures actually. So there doesn't seem to be a difference in overall carbohydrate oxidation. In the one published study that's out there on kind of exogenous oxidation, so the amount of the carbohydrate that's in that sports drink that is oxidized, there doesn't seem to be a difference there. I believe there's a second study that will be published relatively soon that will add to that story potentially, and there doesn't seem to be any difference in kind of GI symptoms. And I guess there's a number of ways of interpreting that. First of all, it suggests that there isn't really any beneficial effect. But again, you have to take that within the context of the experiments that have been done. And so far, I think the longest experiment we've had is about 3 hours, and 3 hours of running, which isn't a short amount of running, certainly not on a treadmill. And in that situation, there wasn't much of a difference between the two. We've also had studies, and that was by from Javi Gonzalez's lab in Bath. We've also had work from Ben Lee and the group that he was working with at Chichester, although Ben's now based at Coventry, looking at ingestion of kind of the hydrogel-based sports drinks in a hot environment. And those are two areas where we might expect greater GI distress. The heat and also the running situations might be expected to predispose to that. So the fact that there wasn't a difference there is perhaps telling that there might not be a huge effect in that 2 to 3 hour range. But the question that remains in my mind is whether if you consume the drinks over a longer duration, and this is where the lab-based research, 2.5 hours of cycling is not necessarily compatible with the type of field-based cycling that many cyclists would do. 3, 4, 5 hours is almost a normal duration for a cyclist to ride, and over those durations, might we see differences in those outcomes? And I think it could go one of two ways, because if things are emptying from the stomach quicker, then there's the chance that upper GI and kind of stomach comfort itself might be better. But if it's emptying into the intestines at a rate too fast to then be absorbed, might there be some effects on lower GI responses? And I think it would be really interesting to kind of, for somebody, hopefully, I don't think it's going to be us that will do it because we've got other fish to fry at the moment, but hopefully someone will do a 4 or 5 hour ride with this kind of hydrogel technology and the traditional sports drink, and we can see whether there's any effects there. So please, if somebody's done that, do let us know.
Yes, by all means, let us know. But hopefully other research groups are able to perform these trials with cyclists with a longer duration and a mix of sports foods to see if in those conditions we can finally see some effects. And you've also mentioned something interesting there regarding how the results can go two ways. One by increasing gastric emptying and therefore improving upper GI, and the other way where that increased gastric emptying could deliver carbohydrate at a faster rate to the gut and perhaps too fast to be digested or uptaken, and therefore promoting other GI symptoms. But I must confess that I do like the idea that the market of sports drinks is being shaken again, and I kind of hope that the results are favorable for other brands to work on improving their products so that runners, cyclists, and ultra runners as well benefit from this and increase our understanding of how to minimize gut discomfort. Which brings me to you again, Steve, and gosh, I haven't asked you anything in a while now. So from what we've been able to study in the past couple of years, plus what you have observed in your study, does it seem that the addition of alginate and pectin promotes any reduction in the GI symptoms when compared to other drinks with the same glucose-fructose ratio?
From the studies that have been conducted, it doesn't seem to either enhance or detract from the GI symptoms, so it doesn't seem to make it worse. It doesn't seem to improve it. We noticed slightly increased stomach fullness, but that didn't seem to have too much an effect on gastric emptying, as we saw similar blood glucose concentrations and total carbohydrate oxidation. But I think one thing to bear in mind with a lot of the studies is the intensity that it's being conducted at. And so at 50 to 60% VO2 max, probably not going to see as much issues with gastrointestinal symptoms as we might at much higher intensity. So if you're doing a 210 marathon working at 80% VO2 peak, VO2 max, sure, there's going to be a lot more stress on the gastrointestinal system compared to cycling at, say, 55 watt max, as we had in our study. So I think in the research that's been conducted, there doesn't seem to be anything. But what we kind of need to do is go, well, what happens when intensity increases? And we know that above 70, 75-ish% VO2 max, we start to see a reduction in gastric emptying. And so that might be the point at when these drinks become a lot more beneficial. So we need a bit more further work in terms of those. But as from what we've seen, and there's been the study in the heat from Ben Lee's group and Tessa Flood, and then a study in the cold, doesn't seem to be any difference in any markers of gastrointestinal symptoms.
Stephen, that was again a tremendous point to raise. Now, adding up the intensity factor to what we've been talking so far regarding doing protocols that are more similar to competitive scenarios that occur with longer duration, higher intensity, and with a mix of carbohydrate providing foods. So, Steve, just to again emphasize this point, do you believe that protocols with higher intensity in the ranges you've just mentioned on top of a mixed provision of solid and liquid carbohydrate sources would be interesting to perform to provide a closer context to a competitive scenario?
I think so, definitely. If we see sort of, I think we'll come on to performance, anecdotally, where the hydrogel technology seems to come into its own, and if you link performance with the drink, then they seem to do very well in races of very high intensity, 75, 80, 85% VO2 max. Whereas what we tend to study, and this is a kind of trade-off in terms of research, we get well-trained cyclists in that can hold 55, 60% watt max. And we would love to get the elites of the elites in to come and compete at a very high level, but it's just difficult getting those sorts of high level performance athletes in to be able to test what you want to test at that point. So we are kind of limited in terms of who we bring in, and that kind of dictates to a certain extent the percentage of or the intensity of the exercise that we use as our preload where we give the drink.
The eternal limitation of not being able to have the elite of the elite coming to our labs to test this kind of stuff, but that one is perhaps a lot more beyond our reach, unless of course we are lucky enough to work directly with elite athletes and have them experience these things and see how they feel. Lewis, since you've been coming back to this point of increased gastric emptying, there's something I wanted to ask you regarding this new research performed at University of Cape Town, I think, by Sutil et al., where although it wasn't performed during an exercise protocol, the participants were seated and the authors observed an enhanced gastric emptying. Do you believe there may be something here worth exploring?
Yeah, so the study from Sean Sutil of Cape Town University was, first thing to say was it was actually done in Stirling, the experiment with John Leeper and Stuart Galloway up there. So the research was actually performed in the UK as well. Seems to be quite a lot of research on this product in the UK, to be honest. The first thing to say is I applaud anybody who does any gastric emptying research using the technique they used. It's it's very invasive, placing a nasogastric tube and doing this type of research. So I think to undertake it's kind of and to publish the data is really should be applauded for the authors. It certainly suggests from their data that there is a positive effect on gastric emptying, which supports the anecdotal claims around the product. I do have some questions about the methodology. We were interested in doing something very similar, and I've spoken a little bit to Sean about this at various stages, and we did a little bit of testing in an in vitro setting, trying to model what would happen in the stomach, and so we put the drink into a large flask together with some hydrochloric acid to produce a pH consistent with the stomach and form that hydrogel within the stomach. Mm-hmm. We then attempted to mix a dye with those in vitro stomach contents, as it were, using the technique that you would use, this double sampling gastric aspiration technique. And we've published with that technique before, and we've used it. We've actually used it during exercise as well, although it's a bit more complicated to use during exercise. We haven't published that data yet. And what we found was that we got incomplete mixing. So there's a bit of a question in my mind as to whether the dye that you put in, the phenol red, mixes throughout the contents of the stomach once that hydrogel is formed. And given that there's normally a kind of 10-minute period between ingesting that drink and making the first measurement of gastric emptying, the rate of gastric emptying, and what you do there, you mix the stomach by aspirating out the gastric contents through a large syringe. You take a sample from that, which you can measure the phenol red concentration in. You add some dye, and then over a 1-minute period, you attempt to mix that dye consistently with the stomach contents, and then take a second sample from the stomach, and the change in dye concentration allows you to calculate the volume that's in the stomach. So we had a few questions from our initial piloting of whether that mixing is complete and whether you would get an accurate reading of the volume of the stomach. Because if it only mixes with 2/3 of the volume of the stomach, the concentration of the phenol red in the stomach would tell you that there is only 2/3 of the stomach contents there, and that perhaps it's emptied faster at the start of the period. So we actually, relatively soon before the lockdown, we had just got ethical approval with a colleague and collaborator of mine at Manchester Metropolitan University, Gethin Evans, who does a lot of work on gastric emptying after exercise, during exercise, and just at rest, to use the 13C acetate breath test, which isn't influenced by any mixing of stomachs, as a pretty good surrogate marker of gastric emptying for initially at rest. So we're still waiting to do that study, and hopefully we will be able to get it going at some point in the not too distant future, and that will give us another idea of whether there is this effect on gastric emptying. So I think the results are really interesting. You know, I was really pleased to see them published. I'd seen them at a conference a few years back, and it certainly adds a potential another piece. But I still have some questions around whether you can really mix the dye with all the contents of the stomach if a hydrogel is formed. The second question I have is, if a hydrogel is formed and you really quite vigorously mix the stomach contents, do you actually break up that hydrogel and then influence the rate at which it moves through the stomach? So does the technique fit the purported effects of the hydrogel technology? So yeah, I have a few questions at the moment, but I think really interesting study, and like I say, take my hat off to the authors for actually even trying to do it.
Well, my respects to everyone that performs gastric emptying related research, now that I know everything that's going on there, and perhaps too much to get into further detail given the schedule of today's episode, but nonetheless necessary to prove if it matches the claims by these hydrogel drink manufacturers. And from this, we go straight to the effects on exercise performance on the different trials. And from what I was able to see from the review from Andy King, Joshua Rowe, along with Professor Louise Burke, studies looking at performance range from cycling, running, and cross-country skiing, and with the majority measuring exercise performance using time trial, others using time to exhaustion protocols, and one using a repeated sprints test. Most studies looking at performance provided a pre-exercise meal. So, Stephen, could you tell us a bit about the results of using this type of drink on exercise performance, and perhaps within the context of the limitations we've been highlighting in terms of intensity and duration of the trials?
So in the studies that have been performed so far in running and cycling, and most of them tend to do a performance test between about 8 and 25 minutes. One study did a bit longer, where they did intermittent sprints in between that. there doesn't seem to be any difference in performance. But that's related to, as Lewis kind of mentioned, what we do in a laboratory setting, where we try to make it as controlled as possible. So we tend to use a good study is often double-blinded, so the participants don't know what they're ingesting. So we automatically remove any placebo effect that the drink might have, which in some instances, if you're at a race or on the bike and you see another team getting a certain drink that has won the last 20 races, or the Tour team has been using that effectively and won everything, then you might think, hang on a minute, they're getting something pretty good here. So we kind of lose a bit of placebo effect. But in terms of pure physiology, we've not seen anything different in performance. Again, the lead up for most of these studies is fairly controlled, moderate intensity exercise. So we're not really stressing carbohydrate stores as much as we would at a higher intensity. And often the studies, the performance tests don't necessarily match what you would do in a real world. So we try to do as I mentioned before, a linear factor time trial where it's based on cadence. So the faster you go, the quicker you do it. The slower you pedal, the slower you go. So the resistance alters depending on that, which is a little bit like real life, but you'll have surges, you'll have different pacing strategies. You'll probably start off quick, slow down, speed up at the end. So we see slightly different things in terms of what we do in the lab. And again, we're also often looking for statistical difference rather than necessarily the minute differences that could separate first and second in a real world setting. So where we might see statistically, one trial won't be different based on statistics. In actual fact, a 3-second difference is the difference between first and fifth in some rates. So in a scientific setting, in a laboratory, in the controlled studies that have been done so far, we don't see a difference in performance. But again, we need to do a little bit more in terms of changing the intensity beforehand, perhaps making it a bit more ecologically valid in terms of future studies.
For sure. I really like the approach we're having here. We're not just showing the research and be done with it. Sometimes we have to see beyond that. I mean, we could perfectly be saying that, well, it doesn't increase performance, it doesn't reduce gastrointestinal complaints, or perhaps I should rephrase this. It increases performance similarly to traditional sports drinks. The GI symptoms appear to be similar, not worse, and the substrate oxidation is also similar. But I guess you're being quite clear that perhaps we haven't done the right studies yet with the right conditions to see benefits with these products. And I'm excited to see what's yet to come, and hopefully we can bring this topic back in the future to see if the additional data points in a different direction. And before wrapping up, there's one interesting and perhaps relevant aspect to go through today. So we know that carbohydrate drinks often have added acidulants, which may have deleterious effects on oral health. And a recent study looked exactly at this and provided in one group amylopectin starch, a maltodextrin sucrose drink, a maltodextrin fructose hydrogel drink providing 95 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and found a less pronounced pH fall for the maltodextrin and fructose hydrogel group compared to the acidulant containing maltodextrin and sucrose group and amylopectin. So, Lewis, looking at this new data, do you believe that hydrogel drinks could perhaps have a more protective effect in the oral health of athletes? And just how promising and relevant is this new field of research?
Yeah, I think for sure it's a side question, really, isn't it? So we've got the fundamental physiological effects of the different sources of carbohydrates and the different ingredients there, and their influence on performance, on exogenous oxidation, on GI comfort, and obviously those latter two will clearly feed into performance effects. And then we've got additional potential effects of different drink ingredients, and clearly anything that might have a potentially beneficial health effect on the athlete without negatively influencing performance is certainly an important component. It's just chopping up what the specific ingredients within the product are that have those effects. So yeah, certainly oral health is one that is going to be important for individuals, endurance athletes that consume an awful lot of simple sugars. It's one of the potential negative effects of consuming high carbohydrate intakes during exercise. So yeah, anything that can beneficially help oral health, I think is a positive, isn't it?
No doubt. Steve, would you like to add anything to this?
I agree with Lewis. I think anything that can help in that sense is good. We also have to look at how these drinks are, or how any sports drinks are often used. You think of a Grand Tour, 21 days out of 23, the athletes are consuming large amounts of their sports drink, their sports gels, Coca-Cola, anything like that for 4, 5, 6 hours on a bike, day in, day out. So I think it's the long-term effects, and if we can do a bit more investigation into that to find out a bit more of how it might affect athletes in the long term, then that's going to be good as well.
The other thing to add there as well, just thinking about it, Gabriel, is not, stepping outside the oral health kind of question as well, is the palatability of the drinks. And if perhaps you don't get that, very almost clogged up feeling of consuming something very sweet, then maybe that might also increase ad libitum intake. And in most practical settings, except very few, there's some specific examples where this isn't the case, and athletes are targeting actual intakes. But for the vast majority of endurance athletes, they probably consume fluids at a relatively ad libitum rate. If something increases their ad libitum intake, that will potentially increase their carbohydrate and also their fluid intake during exercise, and that's a really important practical consideration. So palatability of fluids is one key consideration, I think, when we're looking at what we're providing for athletes.
Again, some great points there by both of you. First, I would highlight what Steve said regarding sugary foods and drinks exposure during 21 days of a Grand Tour. There's a lot of exposure, definitely, and perhaps in such context, if these hydrogel drinks prove beneficial with more studies proving this effect in a consistent manner, perhaps it makes sense. But another thing that also makes sense is to, along with the glycogen replenishing protocol, provide a toothbrush and a toothpaste and do our oral hygiene as part of this fast recovery protocol. Just a thought I'll leave there. And then to your point there, Lewis, if the drink itself, due to its palatability, can increase ad libitum intake, then that's a positive effect by itself. So we're reaching the end. What a shame. I was enjoying this. And I wouldn't like to finish it without asking you, as always, to provide your final thoughts and leave us with a take-home message regarding everything we've been discussing so far. So I'll start with you, Steve. Are hydrogel drinks worth it?
I think this depends. If you look at the research, they obviously contribute to performance and they contribute to carbohydrate oxidation, but they don't. The evidence is there to suggest that they don't necessarily increase it any further. But at the same time, they don't work the other way. They don't negatively impact oxidation, performance, gastrointestinal comfort. So I think the question is, have we done the right studies first? Have we looked at the right intensity? Have we looked at it in the right athletes? Have we looked at it in the right conditions? Have we given enough of the drink to be able to test them appropriately and work out whether they are as good as the claims are, or whether we're just doing the wrong studies? We need to kind of have a look at that and work out what needs to be done, how we can and put those into experiments in the lab, which I think is going to be challenging. But I think it also comes down to personal preference. A lot of this will depend on what is comfortable for the athlete. What do they find as a personal preference? Some of them won't get on with other gels and drinks, but they'll get on absolutely fine with these ones, or vice versa. So I think it comes down to personal preference. I think there's a placebo effect definitely with some of these drinks. The marketing on a lot of them is very good. They have athletes that win major races in cycling and running. So there's definitely a placebo effect there. So I think it comes down to personal preference. It's not going to negatively affect anything, but I think we really need to do a bit more investigation to see where the benefits might lie.
That makes total sense. Since the results are similar to other traditional sports drinks, it might just come down to personal preference for the moment. Lewis, do you agree? What would your final thoughts on this be?
Yeah, I think broadly I'd agree with what Steve said there. I think the research at the moment is relatively clear, and there was a really nice review. One of the things we were looking at doing was producing a review on this topic, and Andy King, working with John Hawley and Louise Burke over in Australia, beat us to the punch and did a really nice job of that. The diagrams they produced were nicer than ours as well, so they'll go better in presentations that I do. So thank you to them for that. But I would recommend anyone goes and reads that review. It's published this year in the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. So I'd recommend people reading that, and it does take you through the kind of science that's there, and also some potential situations where there might be effects. And I think the one thing to bear in mind is that And as I've heard people like Louise Burke say many times in the past, often the science follows the athletes. So you'll sometimes find athletes doing things that the science hasn't yet proved to be efficacious. And there are a large number of good athletes using this type of technology. So that does put one kind of question in my mind. As Steve said, have we asked the right questions or done the right studies to be able to really see whether there's an effect? And if we're looking to do a marathon in less than 2 hours, that's not the same as somebody running on the treadmill or cycling on a bike for 2 hours at 50-60% of their VO2 max. They're very different situations, and we'll likely see very different physiological responses and potentially performance responses to those interventions. I guess the onus is on, I think, the people that produce the product to produce the science to support that now. I think it really would be nice to see some experiments done in those ranges, high intensity, longish duration, to see whether there's any benefits there, or these very long duration type events that you see more in cycling. So yeah, I think at the moment it's a no from me. There's not the evidence there to support the use of that. But as Steve said, it's not a negative effect. So there's no negative to consuming hydrogel type products. And in my view, anything that increases fluid and carbohydrate intake in an endurance athlete is probably a good thing if we're looking to maximize performance. So having it as part of that toolbox to use with an athlete is a potential benefit until those more specific studies emerge.
And this idea, I believe, was left quite clear by the answers you've been providing. For the moment, the research shows that these products are similar in terms of performance, carbohydrate oxidation, and the occurrence of gastrointestinal symptoms. There might be some potential in oral health, more research needed there, and if it increases ad libitum intake, fantastic, and it may just come down to personal preference. These are, I believe, some balanced and most of all fair message regarding this topic. Gentlemen, if people want to get in touch with you or keep up with your social media interactions, where should people go to? Steve?
So my Twitter handle is @Steve_Mears, or my email address is freely searchable on some of the papers we've written in terms of the author contact, or if you search Dr. Stephen Mears at Loughborough University, you'll find my email address. So happy to receive any contacts from there.
Fantastic. How about you, Lewis?
Social media, mostly through Twitter when I do use social media, and that's LJJ_nutrition, or the old-fashioned way through email or telephone, which is available on my profile page on the Loughborough University website. So again, if you just search Lewis James Loughborough University, you'll go straight through to those contact details. So yeah, happy to discuss any of this. And like you say, Gabriel, there's a lot of research to do in this space, and I look forward to seeing what people do and seeing more evidence, because I think it is an emerging topic and could be potentially interesting.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward to that research as well, and hopefully we were able to give a modest contribution and at least identify what needs to be done. And I'll be happy to bring this topic to the podcast again for sure. Any advances in helping athletes meet their high carbohydrate demands with minimal gastrointestinal complaints will always be welcome. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure to have you both here. Steve, I hope you've enjoyed being on the podcast.
It's been very good. Thank you for the invite.
No, thank you for your precious time, Steve. And Lewis, thank you for your second appearance here on Fuel the Pedal. I hope you have enjoyed being here with us again.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks, Gabriel. It was great to chat science again.
And we're done, people. I hope you have enjoyed this one as much as I did. And I think both of our guests were quite open-minded regarding the subject. They presented the research, but they also recognized that perhaps the right studies haven't been performed yet. So for the moment, if you feel that hydrogel drinks work for you and allow you to fuel your rides because of its taste, or because you feel that you experience less gastrointestinal symptoms, then please keep on doing it. But please do brush your teeth after those long-lasting rides or races in which you have to ingest a high amount of sugary foods and drinks. That goes without saying. I'm Gabriel Martins, and you've been listening to episode 37 of Fuel the Pedal podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to have you here quite soon for the next episode. Take care, guys. Over and out.